Hello, my dear friend. This will give us a good connection. So welcome again to Life After Life, Spirit Accounts by Alan Kardec. We meet every Sunday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And in the last couple of weeks, we have been talking about Chapter 1 and the introduction of Heaven and Hell. My name is Sunshine Beck. I reside in California, and I am the co-founder of the Spiritist Center called Bezea Spiritual Healing Center in Penryn, California, near Sacramento. And I'm also the founder of Divine Light Spiritist Center in Nevada City, California, which is in the Sierra Nevada foothills. If you ever come to visit, we'll welcome you. We would love to have you. Let us know. So I want to circle back for a moment before we dive into the new chapter and recap what we've learned so far. You may remember that we talked about the pain level of our transition, and we learned that it is the soul that actually feels pain during and before potentially our transition. And the pain level depends really on the level of how much our perispirit is connected to our physical form at the moment of our quote-unquote death. And that is something that happens before we transition. And then after we transition, but sometimes it starts already before we transition, there is the so-called state of confusion that many spirits experience, which can last years, and the more evolved spirits may only experience that state of confusion for a few hours if they've prepared themselves. Now, what are those two phenomena based on? Why would we feel pain before and during our transition and experience the state of confusion? Well, it is based on our soul's moral development. So it depends how materialistically inclined we lived our life and all the way to the end. And what is the remedy for that? The remedy is that we today start working on and focusing on our inner transformation, that we get away from living a too materialistic life, and that we educate ourselves, and that we remind ourselves at least once a day that our life with this physical body is terminal and that we will experience a transition. So all of this helps us to loosen the bond between our perispirit and our physical form. Then we had Mr. Sanson's lesson last week. He falls into the category of a happy spirit. He was a spiritist, and he taught us two things that I want to repeat. He taught us a lot, but I want to repeat two main things that I thought was very helpful for us that we can incorporate in our own lives, hopefully. He said, one cannot enjoy a lot of things without depriving others of their well-being, thereby morally committing a great evil. That is very important information, don't you think? So the other thing that he mentioned was on page 240, and he said, he essentially gave us the recipe. And he said, you should know, however, that happiness as you understand it is only a fiction. Live wisely and virtuously in the spirit of charity and love, and you will be prepared. So those two things alone we can easily take to heart and focus and practice them every single day a little bit to be aware, to be more aware. So I want to say hello to our dear friends. There's Teresa and there is Soul. So welcome. So happy to have you. I hope you can hear well, and please give me feedback or have questions. I would love to make this an interactive gathering. So if there's nothing else, we will dive into our next case, and we will be continuing with Philippe. Samuel Philippe was probably Samuel Philippe, but we'll say Samuel Philippe because it's easier. We're living here in the United States. And we find him on page 252 in Heaven and Hell by Alan Kardec, if you would like to read along. Hello, Angelita, welcome. So happy to have you. And Renata Casade, lovely to have you as well. So Samuel Philippe is a happy spirit as well. So let us begin. Samuel Philippe was a righteous man in every sense of the word. No one could remember having seen him commit an evil act or having intentionally wronged anyone in any way. He was devoted to his friends, who were always sure to find him at their service when they needed him, even at the expense of his own private interests. Very noble, right? And it's always helpful when we read a book and when we study to instantly reflect upon ourselves and ask ourselves, where are we in this? Are we selflessly dedicated to our friends and maybe also family? Do we put our private interests second when we see someone in need? Work, fatigue, sacrifice, nothing kept him from being useful. He served naturally, without being ostentatious, and seemed perplexed whenever anyone gave him any credit for it. He never wished ill on anyone who had harmed him. He never wished ill on anyone who had harmed him. Instead, he sought to be of service to them, as if they had actually done good to him. Whenever he endured ungratefulness, he would say to us, "I'm not the one you should pity. They are." Let us stop. Let us pause here for a moment. I think this is worth looking a little bit deeper, because how often are we capable of experiencing harm, experiencing a difficult, painful situation, and we don't feel the need to retaliate, but we instantly forgive the so-called offender, and we try to help them. Now what comes to mind here is the Gospel according to Spiritism, of course. There's chapter 11. And chapter 11 is loving one's neighbor as oneself. There we're learning loving one's neighbor as oneself, doing unto others what we would want others to do unto us, namely the golden rule, is the most complete expression of charity there is, because it sums up all our duties towards our neighbor. So what Mr. Philippe was practicing was really the most complete expression of charity according to the Gospel, according to Spiritism. Because it shows us that we love our neighbors. We would follow the golden rule of doing unto others what we would like them to do unto us. And again, this is the most perfect expression of charity. And it sums up all our duties towards our neighbors. So this is something we can easily take to heart, to practice every single day, to have a little sticky note on our refrigerator or our mirror in our bathroom in the morning to remember the golden rule, to run all our choices and moments in our everyday life through the golden rule. And this loving one's neighbor as oneself does not only refer to our incarnate companions, but also to our discarnate companions, right? How many times do we encounter, just for example, in our disobsession meetings, disgruntled, unhappy, angry, revengeful spirits? And what are we called upon? How are we supposed to react to them when we follow the gospel according to Spiritism? We're supposed to love them. We are called to love them, to raise ourselves above the injustice that they have experienced and may express towards ourselves. So let us move on to the Spirit's book, question 876, which is related to that. So Spirit's book, question 876, there we're learning that the golden rule is the basis of justice, founded on natural law or the law of God. So here we're learning one other aspect of the golden rule. At first we heard it's the most complete expression of charity to practice the golden rule. Now we're learning that it is also the basis of justice, justice that is founded on God's law. And when we move further to question 875 in the Spirit's book, Allan Kardec wisely asked the illuminated spirits, how do we define justice? And he said, respecting the rights of all persons. So how can we best respect the rights of all persons? And that includes the ones who cross us, who we may have an issue with. That is by practicing the golden rule. That is the most charitable, most just approach to deal with, for us, difficult spirits, may they be incarnated or discarnated. So now we see that Samuel Philippe was quite an evolved soul, because he practiced exactly that, the highest form of charity and justice. Through his response, he never wished ill on anyone who had harmed him. Instead, he sought to be of service to them as if they had actually done good to him. A lot to learn for us, right? Let's take a deep breath and let us anchor ourselves in this piece of wisdom that just fell into our laps. So let us continue. Although he was very intelligent and endowed with much energy, we're still talking about Mr. Samuel Philippe, his very laborious life was obscure and full of severe trials. He was one of those elite types who flourish in the shadows, whom the world does not recognize and whose light is not reflected over the earth. Through an understanding of Spiritism, he acquired an ardent faith in the future life and a great resignation before the ills of earthly life. I repeat the sentence. Through an understanding of Spiritism, he acquired an ardent faith in the future life and a great resignation before the ills of earthly life. Let us pause again. We are reminded about the Gospel according to Spiritism again, particularly when we read the word resignation. And we may wonder, what actually is resignation? How can we define it? So we go to the Gospel according to Spiritism, chapter 9 this time. And chapter 9 is Blessed are the meek and peace-loving. It is on page 164 in case you want to open the Gospel. And there we're reading, at all points, Jesus' doctrine teaches obedience and resignation. So we're learning that at all points, Jesus' doctrine teaches us obedience and resignation. So resignation and obedience are two really important aspects for us to grasp and practice. So these two, obedience and resignation, are two very active companion virtues of meekness. So now, how is obedience defined? Obedience is the consent of reason. And resignation is the consent of the heart. So here we are. Mr. Philippe practiced resignation. Again, a high virtue. He was an evolved spirit. So obedience is the consent of reason, and resignation is the consent of the heart. And it continues on. The coward cannot be resigned, and the proud and selfish person cannot be obedient. So now we may ask ourselves, to what degree can I resign myself to circumstances, events, and people in my life that are hurtful, difficult, scary? Am I a coward? And can I not resign to those events and people? Can I not consent with my heart to them and respond like Mr. Philippe through charity and the golden rule? Where are we in that regard? And the same with obedience. To what degree are we obedient? And by obedience, I don't mean blind obedience, like blind faith. No, obedience is defined as consent of reason. So if somebody tells me to go to the 5th floor of an apartment building and jump, am I going to jump? No, because reason tells me I'm at least going to get hurt. I may actually kill myself. So no, of course I'm not going to be obedient to someone telling me something like that. However, if reason tells me it is a good choice, and that also applies to us listening to the good spirits, to our mentors, then we are obedient. And for that, we cannot be selfish and we cannot be prideful. We cannot be proud, because we need to recognize that there is a higher being, namely God and the good spirits, who may know more than we do. So let us continue on with the Gospel according to Spiritism, chapter 12. Love your enemies. If someone strikes your right cheek, offer him the other also. We go to page 205 in the Gospel according to Spiritism, in chapter 12, page 205. Let us open it up, because it shows us a little bit more of what Mr. Samuel was actually practicing and what we can incorporate in our own lives to prepare ourselves for what? For an easier transition at the end of our lives. So here there is a subchapter in chapter 12. It's called, If Someone Strikes Your Right Cheek, Offer Him the Other Also. And we're reading. If someone strikes your right cheek, offer him the other also. By these words, Jesus did not interdict self-defense, but condemned vengeance. So eye for an eye, anger, striking, reacting versus responding. By saying to offer one's cheek when the other has been struck, he is saying in another way that one should not repay evil with evil. Let us not follow Moses' law. Eye for an eye. That people should humbly accept everything that tends to lower their pride. That it is more glorious for one to be wounded than to wound. To bear patiently an injustice than to commit one. That it is worthier to be deceived than to deceive. To be ruined than ruin others. So this is really important information, friends, isn't it? It is something for us to learn that when our one side, when our own one cheek gets struck, when somebody acts out towards us as we feel unjustly, that our pride and our selfishness doesn't act out, but that we turn the other cheek and respond with kindness, with forgiveness. That we remember that it is more virtuous to be wounded than to wound. That it is more virtuous to endure injustice than to act out injustice. That it is better to be ruined than to ruin. And very easily, when we experience a very difficult situation, we're very, very much tempted. Most of us are very tempted to retaliate. And that is something that we are called upon today, once again, to take to heart and pause ourselves and step back and remember what Jesus told us. Self-defense is okay, but vengeance is not. And to be charitable, we turn the other cheek. We respond with kindness. We love our enemies. We forgive the incomprehension of others, as Abigail told Paul of Tarsus when he had a difficult moment. So, this also reminds us, in a reversed way, of the prayer of peace by St. Francis. The prayer of St. Francis. Here we're being taught that, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Doesn't this prayer sum it up so beautifully? It is one of my most favorite prayers I like to pray in the mornings. As a reminder, like a reset button. Okay, this is what's important, right? Okay, so we're going back to Mr. Philippe. So Mr. Philippe, we knew how to practice resignation, the surrender of the heart. And he lived an unassuming life, even though he sounds like quite a wise spirit. After having suffered a painful disease, Mr. Samuel Philippe, died in December of 1862 at the age of 50. So he excarnated when he was young. He was truly mourned both by family and friends, and has been evoked many times since his death. Let me pause here for a moment because I'm seeing some remarks and I want to really respond to everyone. Melissa Deline, welcome, dear friend. Nora Basil is watching, so lovely to have you. And Teresa is saying, prayer of transformation of San Francisco, yes. And Nora Basil, thank you, Teresa. And Nora Basil, thank you for being here as well. So now here is the first question that Mr. Philippe was asked during his first invocation. Do you clearly remember your last few moments on earth? Perfectly, he says. My memory of them has returned to me little by little, although at the time my thoughts were still confused. Now, question number 2. So what we're learning here is that he remembers clearly, he says, and yet his memory, his thoughts were a little confused. But it sounds like he did not have a lot of confusion after his excarnation. But he did have a lot of pain before his excarnation due to his illness. So let us see what else he experienced. So the next question is, would you mind describing to us, for our own instruction, how your passage from the corporeal to the spirit life occurred, as well as the situation in which you now find yourself in the spirit world? So this is a twofold question. So the people who asked the question and we want to know how his passage was and where does he find himself now in the spirit world. Because we know he has been a happy spirit, he was a spiritist, he did a lot of good. He seemed to be wise. And he answers gladly. and he's actually taking a little detour, and we're detouring with him, and later on he will actually answer those questions. So we'll reconnect them, but we follow his little detour, okay? So he says at first, you know how full of tribulation my life was. However, I never lacked courage in the face of adversity. Thank God, he says. So we want to pause here because this seems to be another virtue for us, something else to incorporate potentially into our lives and to see where we are at in terms of courage in the face of adversity. So we're going to go to the gospel. The gospel is so rich and has all the information, doesn't it? This time we're going to the Gospel, chapter 11, loving one's neighbor as oneself. Item 11 on page 192. If you want to follow along, we're going to open it up on page 192, chapter 11. We've been here before, but this is a different section. And it is a sub-chapter called Selfishness by Emmanuel, our beloved Emmanuel, who is so clear, right? He kind of just cuts right through. And he does it again. He doesn't disappoint us. So in this selfishness chapter, he says, selfishness, that plague of humankind, must disappear from the earth, whose moral progress it hinders. Selfishness is the target at which all true believers must aim their weapons. That's a pretty strong statement. Selfishness is the target that all true believers must aim their weapons, their strength and their courage. So here we see he links selfishness, the defeat of selfishness, with courage. I say their courage because more courage is needed to overcome oneself than to overcome other people. Another important aspect. So for us to overcome ourselves, our own selfishness, is harder work, is more difficult than to overcome other people. So we need an extra dose of courage to deal with our own selfishness. Let all of you, therefore, make every effort to fight selfishness within you, for that monster that it devours all minds, that child of pride, is the source of all the miseries of this world. It is the negation of charity and consequently the greatest obstacle to human happiness. We know from the Spirit's book that selfishness and pride is the antidote to charity, and that charity is the highest virtue that we are striving for, and that charity is defined by the illuminated spirits in the Spirit's book by benevolence towards everyone, indulgence towards the imperfection of others, and forgiveness, the forgiveness of the incomprehension of others. So charity is high in our goal to reach, and selfishness prevents us from being charitable. And selfishness would also prevent us from practicing the golden rule, correct? Because sometimes it just in the moment feels so much better to indulge ourselves and not pay attention, to selfishly just have the camera on us and forget that there's other people out there. And we learned earlier that the golden rule is one of the important things to be charitable, to practice God's justice. So Emmanuel is very clear. We need courage, most and foremost, to deal with our own selves, our own selfishness. And we read here that Mr. Samuel Philippe had courage in the face of adversity. And we're learning that his adversity probably also related to himself. We continue on with the Gospel, chapter 24. Do not hide your lamp under the bushel. The word courage pops up here again. And this time we learn that courage is linked to faith. Let us see what we learn here. This is on page 368. Let us see how else we can be filled with courage in our lives. And it is linked to faith, page 368, in chapter 24, The Courage of Faith. Let us read. Courage of opinion has always been held in great esteem of humankind, because there is merit in facing the danger, persecution, opposition, and even the simple sarcasm to which are exposed those who are not afraid to loudly profess ideas that are not the same as everybody else's. We know this phenomena, and sometimes it's taken to the hills on social media. Somebody said to me the other day, the so-called keyboard heroes. I thought that was very funny. It's those people who hammer out a lot of opinions and criticism on Facebook, social media, Instagram, and they're the so-called keyboard heroes because they're sitting in the privacy of their home and they hammer it out, right? But back to the gospel. So here we continue on with courage of faith. Jesus condemned such cowardice from the special point of view of his doctrine, saying that if anyone is ashamed of his words, he will be ashamed of him or her. So he says, those who are afraid to confess that they are disciples of the truth are not worthy of being admitted into the kingdom of the truth. They will lose the benefit of their faith because it is a selfish faith that they keep to themselves, in which they hide out of fear that it might bring them harm in this world. Whereas those who, placing the truth above their own material interests and proclaiming it openly, work simultaneously for their own future and the future of others. So, if we are disciples of the truth and we're following Jesus' teachings, we are called upon to be courageous and not hide our lamp under the bushel in that regard. We're being called to be courageous and express the truth that we learn from Jesus, which we so wonderfully get in the Gospel according to Spiritism, as well as in the third part of the Spirit's book, the Divine Laws. So it is courage of faith to speak our truth and not hide, that we see Jesus as our guide and model, that we are practicing the truth that we learn through Spiritism and the good spirits and the Gospel and the Spirit's book and so forth and so on. You know what I'm talking about. So we're guessing that Mr. Samuel did not have an issue with that because he displayed courage. Lastly, we want to go to Living Spring. Probably all know this book by Emmanuel. And we found this beautiful chapter, Living Spring by Emmanuel. We found this beautiful chapter on courage, believe it or not, on page 195. It's chapter 50. Yes, forgiveness, absolutely. Juarez Jr., forgiveness is the key of our work, and we will get there in a moment too. It is the utmost and probably one of the most challenging things for most of us. So, Living Spring, chapter 90, page 195. It's a short chapter, and I thought it would be very helpful for us to read it. And it starts, and it's called Courageously. And it starts with a quote by Paul of Tarsus, that he wrote in the Corinthians. And he says, "Be on your guard, stand firm in the faith." See how it links to what we just read about the courage of faith? Be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, act courageously, be strong. What a powerful recipe for us, right? To remember that every single day. So let us see how we can understand it better. Be on your guard in the daily struggle, Emmanuel says. Stand firm in the faith when faced with a storm. The courage of faith. Act courageously in every difficult situation. Be strong in suffering in order to receive its lesson of light. Still today, Paul's advice to the Corinthians is clothed in surprising appropriateness. Isn't that the truth? We need that lesson. We need to be reminded to be on our guard, to stand firmly in our faith, and to act courageously and to be strong. In order for us to receive the substantial qualities of redemptions, we must have the courage of those who trust in the Lord and in themselves. A flood of unreasonable tears is worthless before a wrong that has been committed. It is our duty to repent of any evil we may have done, but to continuously feel sorry about it is wasting our time in redeeming it. We must move on. Of course, deliberate evil is a crime. However, a thoughtless wrong is a valuable lesson as long as we incline ourselves to the Lord's designs. This is why we learn. We are all children of God. We are in the school called Earth, and we learn by our mistakes. So, like a little toddler who is learning to walk, they fall and they get up. They fall and they get up, and so do we. Without moral resistance in the storm of purifying conflicts, even the noblest heart falls apart. Therefore, we cannot rest in our endeavor of spiritual growth. Of course, we will stumble many times. Of course, we will get scratched by thorns along the way. Our situation will be regrettable. However, whenever we demand a soft bandage of undue consolations, thus halting our journey to the Almighty. Christians are not students that allow themselves undeserved rest. Disciples of a master who served whoever needed him until his final testimony on the cross, they must toil at sowing and harvesting the infinite good, being on their guard, helping and acting courageously. So Emmanuel calls us to be working for the good, nonstop and all the time, to not get discouraged, to lose our courage in the face of adversity, to pick ourselves up and know we are enrolled in the school called Earth, that we are learning by our mistakes. Yes, we are not committing premeditated evil. No, we won't do that. But if we make a mistake and committed an evil act, unconscious act, then, and we realize it, we rectify it and we move on. We don't mope, we don't sit in the corner. No, we keep pressing forward. And as Emmanuel tells us in chapter 10 of Thought and Life, he says we must seek the goodness, we must feel goodness, we must visualize goodness, and we must mold it with all the resources we can muster, which is a strong calling for our souls, for our minds, to stay aligned courageously and to never give up. It's a wonderful chapter, right? Very encouraging. It just keeps us going in a positive way. So let us go back to Mr. Philippe. See, we are on page 254, and he said, I never lack courage in the face of adversity. Thank God, he says. Oh, my friends, may you grasp this truth, for in it resides the happiness of your future. That's how important courage is. No, a few years of suffering is certainly not too much to pay for such happiness that he experiences now on the other side. If only you knew what a few years are when compared to eternity. Now this is another lesson that we ought to take to heart. To see our lives on the eternal line of many, many lifetimes. And on that line of eternity of lifetimes, our current life is very short. And Mr. Philippe encourages us to be courageous and to not succumb to our suffering, but to know, as Mother Mary told us, this too shall pass. Because if we take our suffering in strides and we do not retaliate and we do not become disobedient, we will reach a happy life on the other side, as he tells us. Oh, my friends, if you only knew. He continues to say, to erase the last traces of my previous wrongs, and he also refers to previous wrongs of previous incarnations. I had to suffer those final trials in my last incarnation, and I voluntarily accepted them. Another lesson for us, and something to ask ourselves, as our dear friend Vanessa always says, a therapeutic question for ourselves. To what degree do we voluntarily accept our trials? To what degree do we resign to our trials? And remember, resignation is the surrender of our hearts. I drew from the firmness of my resolution the strength to bear them without complaining. This chapter, dear friends, is so rich, right? Another question we could ask ourselves, how often do we succumb to complaining, right? Now I bless them in every single one of those trials. Thanks to them, I have broken my connections with the past, and it has become only a memory. So he's really teaching us that when we stay with our pain, our hardship, our losses, our illnesses, our whatever it is that we may experience, we will rise ourselves to the top. Those pains will be forgotten, but the redemption we receive is so much more. Oh, he says, you who made me suffer while I was on the earth, who were hard and ill-willed towards me. He's talking about those. Remember at the beginning he said that he lived a life where he had a lot of adversaries. He had a lot of backlash that he experienced. So he speaks to them in an indirect way. Oh, you who made me suffer while I was on the earth, who were hard and ill-willed towards me, who humiliated and afflicted me, whose bad faith often led me to the harshest privations. I not only forgive you, I thank you. Wishing to do me wrong, you didn't even suspect that you were actually doing so much good. It is therefore true that I owe you for a big part of the happiness I now enjoy, for you provided me with an opportunity to forgive, to return evil with good. God put you in my way in order to test my patience and enable me to practice the most difficult kind of charity. What is the most difficult kind of charity? We mentioned it earlier, friends. What is the most difficult kind of charity? It is, of course, loving our enemies. How many of us can actually forgive to the degree that Mr. Philippe was able to forgive, where forgiveness turned into gratitude towards his offenders. His offenders actually became helpers in his inner transformation, on his soul growth. And consequently, when we can forgive wholeheartedly our enemies, those we have a hard time with, may they be in family, friendship, co-workers, wherever, if we can forgive them and return love for evil, to practice the golden rule, to take St. Francis's prayer to heart, that is when we see the beauty in them being in our lives. There is a wonderful YouTube video that we've shown in our Spirit Center many times because it's so helpful. It was made by a German, and his name is Hans Wilhelm, and it is on forgiveness. It is short, succinct, clear, and ever so helpful, where we understand what we do to ourselves most and foremost when we don't forgive, and how we serve ourselves and everyone else around us, not least our health, when we forgive. And that actually forgiveness is really a form, if we practice it correctly, it's a form of gratitude that we experience. So if you guys are interested in knowing the link, in receiving the link to this particular video, I'm happy to post it later. Just let me know here and I will post it under this video. Forgiveness also. So let us go back what he says. So he says that the people that created the harshest privations to him, he did not only forgive them, he thanks them. So he did the deepest soul work. He was capable of that. And then he said, it is therefore true that I owe you for a big part of the happiness. So he's actually now feeling indebted to his persecutors. How beautiful is that? Can we reach that, friends? Can we get there with those who we have a hard time forgiving? Maybe we start with those cases that are a little easier to deal with and then work our way gradually up to that big person or situation that we have the hardest time to forgive. So we can find this gratitude. And he says, I now enjoy, for you provided me an opportunity to forgive, to return evil with good, to turn the other cheek, as we learned earlier. God put you in my way in order to test my patience and enable me to practice the most difficult kind of charity, loving one's enemies. Wouldn't we want to practice that difficult kind of charity for our own soul growth? Why would we run away from people that have harmed us, in our minds harmed us? Why would we not want to forgive and do this ever so beautiful soul work? It also reminds us, the word charity reminds us, forgiveness reminds us of the definition of charity once again in the Spirits book, where the illuminated spirits teach us that practicing charity is being benevolent. Bene, voler, is good-willed, so benevolent, indulgent towards the imperfection of others, and to forgive the offenses of others. And here it is. The highest virtue of them all is charity. So how can we not forgive, friends? How can we not work on that? And Mr. Philippe is a beautiful example of the work well done. And of course, in the Lord's Prayer, we also learn that we can only be forgiven to the extent that we forgive. And we must not forget that too, either. That we have also committed offenses, knowingly or unknowingly. And so for us to be forgiven, we need to forgive. Just like in St. Francis's prayer, whatever we want to receive, we need to give it. So now, remember the question that he asked, and I'm going to go back because he's now actually only starting to answer it. He said, they asked him, would you mind describing to us how your passage from the corporeal to the spirit life occurred? And where do you find yourself in the spirit world? And now he's actually giving us the answer. Although I suffered dreadfully with my final illness, I didn't pass over in agony. My death was like sleep, without struggle or shock. Since I had no fear about my future, I didn't try to cling to life, and consequently didn't have to struggle during my last moments. The separation occurred without effort, without pain, and without my even realizing it. So this is like a dream death. This is what we want, right? So if we want that, Mr. Philippe gives us the recipe of what we need to focus on starting today if we strive for a transition as beautiful and easy as he had one. And he continues, I don't know how long that final sleep lasted, but it was brief. So his state of confusion, his sleep was not long. My awakening was calm compared to my previous condition. Remember, he suffered in his previous life of a long illness. I no longer felt any pain, and I exulted in joy. Beautiful, huh? I wanted to get up and move around, but a sort of gentle numbness, which had nothing disagreeable about it, which even had a certain appeal, restrained me, and I gladly surrendered myself to it without being aware of my situation, but having no doubt that I had just left the earth. So it sounds like a wonderful state he is in, right? It is something we want as well, don't we? Everything around me seemed like a dream. I saw my wife and some friends kneeling and weeping in my room, and I told myself that they obviously considered me dead. I saw myself surrounded by many beloved individuals who had died a long time ago, and others whom I did not immediately recognize, but who seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to wake up. So he was surrounded by a lot of beautiful, loving spirits that were gently waiting for him to wake up. This state was interlaced with moments of lucidity and drowsiness, during which I alternately recovered and lost consciousness of myself. Little by little, however, my mind became clearer. The light that I had only glimpsed through a type of fog became brighter. I then began to recognize my state and understood that I no longer belonged to the terrestrial world. If I had not known Spiritism, the illusions would have undoubtedly been prolonged for quite some time. So we see that Mr. Philippe had a beautiful transition, and he ended up in a very wonderful situation on the other side, surrounded by spirit friends and benefactors, and he felt no pain. It seemed like a very gentle situation he found himself in. But he also tells us that if he hadn't known Spiritism, the illusions, the lack of clarity, the numbness that we had talked about, that we learned about in chapter 1, was it called the state of confusion, would have lasted a lot longer. And why? Because with Spiritism, we have the gift of education, which is what we are doing right now. We're learning of what we can do today to prepare for ourselves for our transition, and hopefully a transition that will be as beautiful and calm as Mr. Philippe's, but maybe close to it, but at least we will be conscious and what we can practice to get there. These chapters are so filled with guidelines for us. It is such a precious gift. How can we not take it to heart and practice, right? Dear friends, let me quickly look here at some notes. Marilda Vega is watching. Thank you so much. Is listening. Welcome, Marilda. And there's Ricardo Pifano. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. There's Juarez. How difficult is it to love enemies? You are so right, isn't it? That's why they're saying it's the most difficult thing we can do. And it's also the most charitable. So yes, for sure, we're all in the same boat and working on it. But we see how redeeming it is and how helpful it will be once we start on that path and we actually succeed. So, Nora Basil, could you please share yes, I will do that. Right when at the end of our session, I will post it right away. You'll see, it'll be very interesting. Lisa Tellis is watching. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure. So now Mr. Philippe continues. I was so happy at being free, he said. I was breathing with the ease of someone who has just emerged from a suffocating atmosphere, and an indescribable sensation of bliss impregnated my entire being. Remember, he had a long, painful disease before he excarnated. So he felt relieved. He felt blissful. Excuse me. I think I need some water. Excuse me, friends. The presence of individuals whom I used to love filled me with joy, and I was not surprised at seeing them. One thing surprised me right at first. The fact that we understood each other without saying anything. We transmitted our thoughts by simply looking at each other, as though by some sort of fluidic penetration. So that's an interesting phenomenon as well, that in the spirit world, excuse me, friends, we can actually read each other's thoughts. And that we can, I'm gonna get some water, excuse me, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry friends. Okay, that we can actually read each other's thoughts, and it's like a fluidic transmission. And in Thought and Life by Emmanuel, we actually learn that we're always under the influence of other people's minds and thinking because of these fluidic transmissions. But it is often more subconscious that we experience it here. But in the spirit world, he is very much aware of the fact that they don't have to talk; they can read each other's minds. Nevertheless, he says, I was still not completely detached from earthly ideas. The memory of what I had endured came back to me from time to time. By the way, I'm on page 257 in Heaven and Hell, if you'd like to read along. I had suffered physically, but especially mentally. Now remember when we learned in chapter 1 that actually it's not the body that suffers per se. It is the soul that suffers. And the body is just the vehicle that allows us to feel the pain. And of course, soul suffering is very much linked to our thinking, because what we dwell in our minds is actually where we will find ourselves in the region surrounded by the people, by the law of affinity. And on the other side, those are the souls that will surround us. So he had suffered physically, but especially mentally, and that was before his excarnation. I had been the target of malevolence, 1,000 vexations that were perhaps more painful than patently misfortunate, because they keep us in a state of constant anxiety, he tells us. This feeling had not yet disappeared completely. So what he's telling us is, yes, he transitioned quite easily. He found himself in a beautiful situation on the other side, surrounded by beautiful, loving spirits, and yet he had moments where he still felt a little attached to earth and his feelings. He had memories of his suffering. But when the certainty hit me that all that had indeed ended, I felt I had been relieved of an enormous weight. So he felt relieved. I was like a poor man who had suddenly received a large fortune, and who for a long time couldn't believe it was real, still feeling worried about his needs. Oh, if only people could comprehend the future life. The future life is life after life. What power, what courage it would give them amidst adversity. So friends, we are called to defocus from our moments, and know that in the long run, the seeds we're putting into the ground today, and if they're loving and good seeds, we will receive that harvest later. So he's telling us that if we only could comprehend the power, the future life, and what power, what courage it would give us amidst adversity. But of course, it is who we create. It's ourselves who create our future life by the seeds we're planting every single day in our garden of eternity. And it's only us, we will reap the harvest. So if you put thistle seeds in, guess what our harvest would look like? So he says, what they wouldn't do during their lifetime, people, on earth, in order to guarantee themselves the happiness that God has reserved for the children who have been obedient to his laws. So he's telling us it would give us so much more courage if we understood our future life, and the things we wouldn't do during our lifetime on earth in order to guarantee ourselves the happiness that God has reserved for the children who have been obedient to his laws. So let us see what this may refer to. What are the things that we wouldn't do during our lifetime in order to help us for our future life. So for that, we go to the Spirit's book, part 3. And in part 3, we find the divine laws. And we find a chapter called Good and Evil. And that we find on page 380 in the third part of the Spirit's book. And it's question 642. Allan Kardec asked the illuminated spirits, in order to be pleasing to God and to ensure our future situation, there it is, you see, friends, the future life, is it enough not to do what is evil? So is it enough to maybe live a neutral life, not to do any evil? Is that enough? Is it enough when we sit back at the end of our days and we follow St. Augustine's recommendation of doing our nightly reviews and we see, oh yeah, it's been an easy day. I didn't do any evil. Is that enough, friends? Let us see what the illuminated spirits tell us. Here's the answer. No, it's not enough. All must do good to the best of their abilities, for all will answer for all the evil, which is defined as ignorance, that has resulted from the good they left undone. Wow. The good spirits just raised the bar high right here. It's like high jump. Now we know, the lower level is not going to serve us anymore. No, we got to stretch higher. So what does he tell? What are we learning here? We're learning that it's not good enough to not do what is evil. But we actually have to dedicate our lives to answer not only for all the things that are evil that we've done, but also that has resulted from the results from what was of all the good we have not done. So all the good that we left undone, we also have to answer for. Those are also thistle seeds we put in our grounds. Not only the evil we may have done, but also all the good we forgot, we omitted in doing. So that keeps us really busy, right? So that is really a high goal. And again, we are reminded of chapter 10 by Emmanuel in Thought and Life. We must seek goodness. We must feel goodness. We must visualize goodness. We must mold goodness with all the resources we can muster. That is why Emmanuel helps us to realize that we need to dedicate our lives 24/7 to do the good. And it's not enough to not do what's evil, to live a neutral life. So, dear friends, lots of lessons, right? So, he also says, we're going back to Mr. Philippe, people would see how insignificant are the pleasures they envy during their life compared to those they disdain. So it's not worth, friends, it's not worth of comparing. We learned already in chapter 1 that if we want to minimize our pain for our transition at the end of life, we have called to dematerialize ourselves, to defocus ourselves from material things. And here Mr. Philippe teaches us the same. So here's the last question that he was asked. Have the spirit world and the many friends whom you have rejoined caused you to forget the family and friends you left behind on earth? So the group that asked him was wondering whether with all the happiness and goodness he's receiving and experiencing on the other side, does that allow him to forget his family and friends that are incarnated? Here's the answer by Mr. Philippe. If I were to forget them, I would be unworthy of the happiness I am enjoying. God does not reward selfishness, he punishes it. The world in which I find myself might lead me to scorn the earth, but I could never scorn the spirits who are incarnate there. It's a beautiful statement, right? Very loving. Yes, he's not scorning us. He might scorn the earth per se, but not us, incarnates. I visit my family often, and I feel happy for the remembrances they hold of me. Their thoughts attract me to them. I watch their conversations. I delight in their joys, and their worries sadden me. However, because I understand that their problems are only temporary and for their own good, it is not the kind of sadness that is full of anxiety like that which we suffer while incarnate. So he says that I understand that their problems are only temporary and for their own good. Friends, another really important reminder and lesson for us to remember that all difficulties, all hardship, all pain we experience during our incarnation is for our own good. It's for our own soul growth. And it is a way for us to undo past wrongs, to expunge ignorant acts we have committed in previous incarnations and perhaps in this incarnation before we knew any better. So this reminds us of blessed are the afflicted, one of the Beatitudes by Jesus. Blessed are the afflicted. Why are we blessed when we are afflicted? Well, we're blessed because now God granted us the opportunity to start undoing past wrong, to work on our soul growth. As Mr. Philippe very wisely recognizes, all the pain, all the vicissitudes of lives are for our own good. Let us breathe into that. Friends, isn't it consoling though to hear all of this? It's very supportive. I find it very supportive and so wonderful to have these guidelines. As Carol Correa always says, the GPS, right? God's GPS that tells us, take this turn, take that turn, go this way. We know how to succeed. All we need to do is to remember and practice. And so let us continue here. I'm striving to help my family, he says, to become worthy. I'm doing my utmost to suggest good thoughts to them, especially regarding resignation. Remember, friends, resignation. Mr. Philippe was resigned to all the hardship he experienced in his life, and he resigned courageously. He never gave up. Resignation, what was the definition of resignation? Do you remember? The gospel, according to Spiritism, turn the other cheek. It was, resignation is the surrender of our hearts. And obedience is the surrender of reason. But a resignation is the surrender of the heart. So he says, I'm doing my utmost to suggest good thoughts to them, his family, especially regarding resignation, which I myself displayed before the will of God. It is aligning our will with God's will. My greatest sadness is seeing them delay that time by their lack of courage, their complaining, their doubts about the future, or by any reprehensible act. This sentence is another great lesson for us. Where are we? Where are we with our courage? Where are we in terms of complaining? How often, how much time and energy do we still waste on complaining? And not remembering that all the vicissitudes of lives are just for our own good. That we need to be grateful, that we need to feel blessed when we are afflicted. And also the doubts, our doubts about the future life. Thank God we have all this beautiful, literally thank God for all this beautiful information that Spiritism furnishes to us. So we can educate ourselves, so we don't have to feel apprehensive about our future life. And now this wonderful book by Alan Kardec, Heaven and Hell, these cases, we're learning so much of how to prepare ourselves so we don't need to waste energy and time on feeling anxious about our future, but that we can trust and have faith in God and His goodness. And lastly, by wasting our energy on reprehensible acts, to either live a neutral life or to forget to do the good, or perhaps even do evil things. So, again, we need to focus on doing the good, as Emmanuel teaches us. Thus, I try to divert them from the path of evil, So we see that Mr. Philippe is even now extremely focused on being charitable. Whenever I'm successful, it is a great happiness for me, he says, and all of us here rejoice. Whenever I fail, I sadly tell myself, once more they have delayed their moment of joy. But I'm consoled when I remember that none are irredeemably lost. This chapter ends on such a consoling note. It tells us that, yes, we may delay our own joy by not focusing on doing the good, on forgetting to forgive, on forgetting to apply the golden rule, on being courageous, on forgetting to focus on charity. We delay our own moments of joy. But nothing is lost, friends, because none of us are irredeemably lost. Those are his words, those Mr. Philippe's words. None of us are. Because due to the goodness of God, the grace of God, our benevolent Father, Mother, Father God, we will always get another chance. Dear friends, this marks the end of this beautiful chapter. And for a moment, if you can, let us close our eyes and say a brief prayer of gratitude. Dear Mother, Father God, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for this beautiful lesson, for this illuminated spirit, Mr. Samuel Philippe, who availed himself to those who questioned him, and who he availed himself to all of us to this day, that we may learn of how to prepare ourselves most effectively and efficiently for our own transition. And not only our own transition, but to put good and loving, beautiful seeds in our garden to help ourselves with our future life and future lives. We are deeply touched by this beautiful gift we received tonight. And we're asking for support and help in the next week to remember the lessons we received tonight. And with this, we're humbly and kindly asking for permission to close tonight's class. And so be it. Dear friends, thank you so much for being here. Yes, we're all learning. We all have a lot of difficulties in our lives. But we received an amazing amount of good lessons tonight, new tools that we can use in our life to come, in our weeks to come. And on this note, many blessings. God bless you. We're thanking Kardec Radio and all the friends who created this beautiful platform that we can meet in this international classroom every Sunday night. We are filled with gratitude, and we hope to see you next week again. We will continue with our spirit reports. God bless you. Good night.